This is Christopher Sernaque, hosting episode 8 of season 2 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcast, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Today, on Current Topics in Science, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Tas Walker. Dr. Walker has a Bachelor of Engineering with first-class honors and a doctorate in mechanical engineering from the University of Queensland. Dr. Walker also has a Bachelor of Science in Earth Science with a focus on geology, including stratigraphy, petrology, paleontology, and geophysics. He went on to obtain an honors degree, which is the U.S. equivalent of a master's, in the field of earth science. Dr. Walker has planned, designed, and operated coal-fired power-generating plants for over 2 decades in Queensland's electric industry and has organized conferences with the Simulation Society of Australia on coordinated operations of the electrical system and on the construction of new power stations. Additionally, Dr. Walker has planned out large hydroelectric developments which required evaluation of geological conditions and the effects on dams, water reservoirs, and underground power station structures. Dr. Walker has been a member of Ministries International since the beginning of the year 1999, is featured in CMI's Evolution's Achilles Heels book and documentary, and has his own website called Biblical Geology. Now, without further ado, good morning, Dr. Walker. How is your day and how are you doing?
It's really great to be here, Christopher. I've had a great day. It's only early in the morning here in Brisbane, in Australia. And so everything's going really well. It's winter here, and I understand it's moving into summer where you are.
That's pretty interesting. Living in different time zones creates different experiences for both individuals.
Indeed.
Now we'll move on to the first question. So since this is Current Topics in Science, we'll quickly look at this week's current topic. The University of Melbourne recently published an article on physics, or phys, which is shorthand for physics.org, called Australia's Ancient Geology Controls the Pathways of Modern Earthquakes. The article contained the following statements concerning Australian geology. New research near Uluru in Australia's arid centre shows that rock structures formed deep within the ancient Gondwana supercontinent controlled the rupture pathways of one of Australia's largest modern earthquakes. Seismological and geological studies led by the University of Melbourne, researchers show that 2016 magnitude 6.0 Petermann earthquake produced a landscape-shifting 21-kilometer surface rupture. The dimensions and slip of the fault plane were guided by zones of weak rocks that formed more than 500 million years ago. The article concluded by saying, the Petermann earthquake is a rare example where we've been able to link earthquakes with pre-existing geological structures by combining seismological modeling and geological field mapping. Dr. Walker, as an Aussie and a geologist and a creationist, what do you make of this current topic?
Well, they've done some very interesting work there. The Peterson Ranges is right in the outback of Australia. There's not many people live near there. It's very arid. And they've gone and they've done analysis of seismographs. And also they've looked in the field at the movements, the actual physical evidence that this earthquake has left. And they've come to the conclusion that what occurred is there was a slip on an old fault plane, which was in that area, rocks which were weakened in that area. And so they call it a reactivation of an old fault, which is fairly common. that occurs in geological history. So they talked about 500 million years ago, that's looking at it from within a long age uniformitarian perspective, but you can transform those dates into a biblical history. And there's articles or research which I've done, and it's published on creation.com website, that shows that's preliminary transformations. And so 500 million years ago would be about a third of the way, heading towards about halfway through the global cataclysm of Noah's flood. And so the flood had been going for some time. There'd been sediments which had been deposited, and lots of action which had taken place. But then the crust of the earth moved, folded the earth, and that would have been when some of those weakened fault plains were put into place at that time. And it's common in that Central Australia. There's another, they call them mountain building episodes. When the crust folds, it pushes the crust up, forming high areas. And so they're tracking that. And they've come up with some quite interesting conclusions. Of course, it's what you might call forensic science, although there were people alive who actually observed and monitored the earthquake which happened in 2016. So that's observational science. But then tying it together is like a detective story. It's a bit like forensic science, tying it together. And so they've come to that conclusion. And that's really, really good. It's interesting that that this earthquake has occurred in the middle of a major plate, in which Australia is part of that plate. It's quite a large plate, and if you look at a map, a world map showing the plate boundaries, you will see that this area is right in the middle of a plate. And the model, the plate tectonic model, the idea is that the plates are rigid, they don't move. And yet there are quite a lot of earthquakes within these plates. But most of the earthquakes occur at the edges of the plates, but these are some which occurred in the middle.
Now, what's actually interesting, you mentioned the flood. In a lecture called Evidence for Noah's Flood in Australia, you said to the listening audience, there is a Bible verse connected with science and apologetics, and you're probably familiar with it. Jesus said, if I've spoken to you of earthly things, and you do not believe, how then will you believe if I speak of heavenly things? Dr. Walker, how did you come to the conclusion that creationist geological models are scientifically viable?
Yeah, well, that is an interesting verse, and we live in a day and age where there's a widespread skepticism, unbelief of the Bible, particularly the Bible's account of how this world was created in 6 days. And the other big event, which the Bible describes, is the global flood at the time of Noah. So there's widespread skepticism of that, and as a result, there's been a widespread falling away, I think you might say, of some of the Christian values which the West was founded on. And that's really connected with what Jesus said, if I've spoken to you of earthly things and you do not believe. So earthly things are things like how God created the earth, the global flood, which destroyed the earth, and which out of which the world that we live in emerged. If we don't believe that, then why should we believe the other parts of the Bible? So that's the relevance of that verse. So how did I come to the conclusion that the creation geological models are scientifically viable? Well, it's interesting that I started becoming interested in this many years ago. And as an engineer, I worked as an engineer, and I always wanted to know how things worked. I always wanted to see how things fitted together. And and a lot of boys are like that. I've got grandsons that are like that. And I could never quite figure out how it worked. But I read a book, and the Creation Ministries International, its former name was the Creation Science Foundation. And they had lots of materials about Noah's flood and how that was a key in being able to understand how the world connected with the Bible, how geology connected with the Bible. And as I read that, basically, I thought I was very excited to see how that worked. I'd never thought of it before, never really seen the significance of it. And after a series of, I suppose you might say, a journey that I was on, we're all on a journey. Basically, I was motivated to go and study geology at the University of Queensland, basically because I developed a biblical geological model. So what happened was I would look at a geological column. You're probably familiar with the geologic column. It's got the various divisions on it. It's got the Cambrian and the Jurassic and the Triassic and the, all those divisions on it. And I could never figure out how in the world does Noah's flood fit into here? Where did it happen? That's what used to puzzle me. And I never saw anything about it. So what happened was I just, on the back of an envelope, one day I came to the conclusion, well, if the Bible's true, what would you expect to find? So that's the question that I asked. And I just drew a little sort of a little framework, a little model on the envelope about you'd expect there'd be rocks that formed during the creation period. Then there'd be the period between creation and the flood, 1,700 years. And then they'd have the flood, the global flood, which affected the whole of the earth. And then you've got the time after the flood. I came up with this little framework, little model. And then I worked out, well, what would you expect to find in each of these sessions, in each of these periods? And so that started me on the geological journey. And what I discovered was that as initially I was quite reluctant, thinking, well, am I going to find it? Is it going to work? Am I going to discover that the Bible really isn't reliable? But over the years, I've come to see that the Bible explains the geological evidence, and it's given me more and more confidence. There's lots of evidence that fits in with what the Bible says, and with the flood model, and to see this fitting together is something that's given me confidence. One of the things that happened is that when I went to the university as a mature age student to study geology, I was a little bit reluctant, thinking, well, I might discover something here that is going to really unsettle me, really unnerve me, really going to show that the path that I'm on is not right. So I was very nervous about it. But what I discovered was that the things I heard that were taught at the university, the books that I read, and the various new things that I discovered, they were all able to be explained from the biblical history. And so rather than losing confidence, I gained confidence. And it's quite amazing how the Bible does explain the world. It explains what we see in the present, and so that we can trust it on the things that we can't see.
Amen. And on that same note, Dr. Walker, in an article called "Framework Makes a Difference to Interpretations of Geological Evidence," you wrote, "We must always judge man's fallible opinion with the infallible Word of God, not the other way around." However, as you know, in today's day and age, skepticism about the accuracy of the Bible has become rather trendy. Even Jesus rebuked skeptics in his day, saying, "For had ye believed Moses, ye would have believed me, for he wrote of me." Dr. Walker, Moses wrote the account of Noah's Ark, which is often ridiculed by skeptics like Bill Nye, who compared it to the Wyoming ship that sank in the famous Ham-Nye debate. Dr. Walker, may you explain how Noah, his family, the organisms, and the ark survived the Genesis flood?
Yeah, well, that is one of the questions that comes up as soon as you start talking about Noah's Ark and Noah's flood. There's a number of fairly standard things that people think about. And what's one of them? Well, how could Noah build the ark? And how could it be strong enough? And how could a wooden boat survive a terrible catastrophe like that? And in actual fact, a lot of people say we never, wooden boats, the largest wooden boat is small compared to what's the size given in the Bible. But in actual fact, when you do a little bit of digging in the history, you realize that the ancient Greeks built very large wooden boats. They were warships, and they had they were lined with oarsmen, so they were propelled by an enormous power of all these men that were on the oars, and they also had sails. And so these Greek ships were not only large, they were not only built for war, but they had to withstand the stresses of these enormous forces of these oarsmen and the sails on the boat. And so some of those boats were comparable in size to Noah's Ark. But that's not all. There's also the Chinese built treasure ships. And some of those were as big or bigger than Noah's Ark. And similarly, they were built with masts and with sails. And so they had to withstand the forces of the wind blowing in the sails, driving the boats through the water. Whereas Noah's Ark, it didn't need sails. And so it didn't have as much stress as some of these large boats. But what we see with these large boats is that they're quite able to be built, they're quite successful, and they don't get destroyed like Bill Nye said about the Wyoming. And as far as all the other aspects of Noah's Ark are concerned, there are many questions that come up. One is, well, how would you get all the animals on? And the question related to that is, well, how many animals had to go on? Of course, there are lots of animals that did not go on. As a matter of fact, there was a skeptic in Australia who used to mock Noah's Ark. And as a matter of fact, that's one of the things that the skeptics do. They love to mock the account of Noah's Ark. And they say, can you imagine how the animals went on? Can you imagine a blue whale flapping up the gangplank? And can you imagine that flapping up the gangplank? And of course, blue whale didn't have to go on because they survived quite well in the oceans. So it was the land-dwelling, air-breathing animals. A blue whale is an air-breathing animal, but it's not land-dwelling. And so then you didn't have to take on all the varieties of animals. The Bible says that take 2 of every kind of animal, 7 pairs of each clean kind, which would be like the sheep and the goats and birds. So 7 pairs of those. And so each kind, so a kind, like if you think of dogs, Noah would have only had to take 2 dogs on. That would be the dog kind. And all the dogs that we have today have descended from the 2 dogs which were on Noah's Ark. Also, you would have the horse kind, from which you get the zebra, the horse, and the donkey. And so when you count kinds, which sometimes is around family level in the taxonomy system. So you've got the genus, and then you've got family level. So could be around the family level. You've got a lot less animals that need to go on the ark. And some have estimated that at the most would be 16,000, and it could even be as low as 2,000 or 3,000 as the number of animals. So getting the animals on, there's plenty of room for all the water and the food. And so when you actually look and do an evaluation of what's involved, you realize that what the Bible describes is quite plausible, quite adequate to do what the Bible says the ark did. And so that answers a lot of those questions to do with Noah's Ark. Another question that comes up with regard to that is, where did all the water come from? That's a puzzle. And I think, how could the water have covered Mount Everest? And it's interesting that, that there are marine fossils on the top of Mount Everest, so it was underwater. And the other question is, where did all the water go to? And the answer to that is that basically, if, you know, at the moment the ocean basins are low and the continents are high, but if you actually even out the surface of the earth, move the basins of the oceans up and the continents, move them down, and the earth's surface is even and smooth, then the water that's on the earth at the present will cover the whole of the earth to a depth of something like 1.5 miles, something like 3 kilometers. And so there's plenty of water on the earth, and it involved movements in the earth's crust. That's what ended up causing the waters to flood the earth.
So while Noah and the ark's inhabitants survived the flood, obviously there were organisms that perished as a result of this catastrophic geological event. Dr. Walker, in an interesting CMI mini-clip called Rapid Rocks, you featured a rapid rock that some friends of yours found at a breach in Brisbane. And inside the rock was a little model car. Commenting on the rapid model car rock, you said, what looked like an old rock that had been there for a long time and fit in with all the other rocks on the beach, when they looked at it closer, they found it could be no more than 10 years old. In your article, Toy Car Rock's Million-Year Belief, you concluded by saying, clearly the rock was not millions of years old. It could have been 10 or 20 years at the most, yet it looked old. Dr. Walker, putting rapidly fossilized cars to the side, how does the Genesis flood factor the fossil record into biblical history?
The point of the car, it's an interesting one, is that I often use an example like that when I'm talking to audiences, because people have this perception in their mind that rocks must be millions of years old, and that it takes millions of years to form things like diamonds and opals and sandstone. You know, there's just this idea of millions of years. It's a mental block. It's a mind-forged manacle that stops people believing that the earth could be young, could be a biblical age. So that's why we put it out. And when people see, you know, that the rock looks old until you turn it over, and then you see the car, and it becomes a bit of a shock. And so we use lots of examples like that. So, but Noah's flood, it explains the fossils. That's one of the things that Noah's flood explains, is that what would you expect to find if there really was a worldwide flood? The Bible talks about how everything that had the breath of life in it perished: birds, livestock, animals that creep on the surface of the earth. Everything perished. And so what would you expect to find? And there's a little saying, which is a cute saying, but you'd expect to find millions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. That's what you'd expect to find. And what do you find? You find these rock layers, which are sedimentary rocks, sand and mud, which covers, you know, something like 75% of the earth's surface, laid down by water, and they're full of dead things. They're full of fossils of animals, like swimming animals like plesiosaurs and chronosaurs and dinosaurs, and things like T-Rex and Triceratops, animals like that. We find that the remains of them in Queensland, where I live, just away from the coast, hundreds and hundreds of miles away from the coast. There continually, the farmers are finding these bones and these animals buried in their paddocks, on their ranches, you might call them in America. The ranchers would find them, And so they're continually finding these things. They're finding footprints of these fossils. And when paleontologists go from the museum, from the university, when they go out and do their research and collect the fossils, they are often amazed at how well preserved they are. So that's one evidence for the global flood. The fact that you find these things fossilized, you often find them well preserved, and paleontologists will say, you know, there must have been some sort of a catastrophe here. So why would they think that there'd be a catastrophe? It's because of their preservation. You know, there's some researchers did some investigations into how much does it take to keep a dead animal buried on the bottom of the river or the ocean. So they experimented with crocodiles, and they would cover the crocodiles, dead crocodiles, with sediment. And they would find that you needed something like a meter of sediment to be on top of the crocodile in order to keep it buried, because as it started to rot, the gases accumulated, it would pop out. And these experiments indicate that you need a lot of sediment. It needs to cover the animal quickly to quite a considerable depth. And so you're not talking about just slow and gradual deposition over thousands of years, but you're talking about a catastrophic burial of these animals. So that's one way in which evidence for Noah's flood is the amazing fossils that are buried all over the earth. And you often find fossils of land animals and marine animals buried in the same area. So how does that occur? It's a catastrophe that involved the land and the ocean. And of course, that's what you'd expect from Noah's flood. And when you actually look at the sediments themselves, you find that sediments are laid down. They're often very thick strata, 1 meter, 2 meters, 5 meters, huge strata that are laid down. And they have little beddings in them, which indicate that they've been laid down by water. Sometimes these beds in these strata are turned back on themselves, indicating that the water was incredibly powerful. And so there must have been a lot of water covering a huge area with lots of sediment. And that totally contradicts the general philosophy that's within the geological fraternity, that everything happened by slow and gradual processes. And if it happens quickly, that means it doesn't take millions of years. It means that it only was a short time. And so Noah's flood washes away the millions of years, and it explains the fossils, and that's the evidence to explain the geological record. It's quite amazing. It's a very amazing journey. It's a very amazing enterprise to unravel all the various effects, and it provides lots and lots of insights into what went on in the past. And it answers questions which have puzzled what we call uniformitarian scientists, those scientists who don't believe in Noah's flood, but who think that it all happened just according to the processes we see happening at the present time, slow and gradual processes. And the evidence actually contradicts that philosophy, which has really got a stranglehold on the modern geological fraternity. And I'd love to see the geologists be more open to exploring new ideas. But they're committed to the idea of naturalism. That's the problem, is they're committed to the idea of naturalism. And so you can't use the Bible as anything to do with your geological investigations. It just is goes against the grain. It's forbidden, verboten. And so I'd love to see a change in that. And maybe one day we will, but who knows?
Hopefully so. And speaking of the Genesis flood, Dr. Walker, in the Evolution's Achilles Heels documentary, in the Geological Records segment, you said, so basically, when we look at the geology of the Earth, we find that present processes do not explain what we see. Rather, what we see points to catastrophic processes in the past. And when we think about what those could be, it fits exactly with the account in Genesis of Noah's flood, which destroyed the whole Earth. Dr. Walker, how does the Genesis flood account for the geology and the geography of the Earth?
Well, that's a big question, but it's an exciting question. A great question to ask. You know, there's a guy who reintroduced the idea of catastrophe into geology. His name was Derek Ager. He was a professor of geology in the UK, and he grew up being taught the standard uniformitarian, slow and gradual geology. That's what he was taught. And but then when he went out and practiced it and looked at the rocks in his professional life, he came to the conclusion that, you know, the evidence that I see does not fit that philosophy, does not fit what I was taught about slow and gradual uniformitarians, always slow. And so what he came up with was what he called the new catastrophism, neo-catastrophism. And he was an advocate of that, and his books became quite popular, Derek Ager. And he gave lots of examples of how the evidence that he saw did not fit with the slow and gradual. One was the nature of the stratigraphical record. He wrote a book called that. And not long before he died, he wrote a book called The New Catastrophism. And one of the examples that he gave was of a vertical tree trunk that extended through layers. They call them the coal measures. So you have coal, and then you've got sediment, and then you've got another seam of coal, and they call them the coal measures. And the coal measures might be, you know, a couple of miles thick, and they have these various coal seams in them. And so they have vertical tree trunks which extend maybe 4 meters through some of these measures, but through various coal seams. And he says it's clear that this tree trunk couldn't have been sitting there for thousands of years waiting to be gradually covered by this sediment. It had to be covered quite quickly because it's not showing any evidence of being rotted at the top. And so he came to the conclusion that there must have been times in the past when sedimentation rates were incredibly rapid. And so that was the concept of the neo-catastrophism. And so that has become popular. And as a matter of fact, there was about Charles Lyell was the guy in the 1830s who published a book about uniformitarianism, and his philosophy is the one that's being followed by the geological fraternity ever since, which Ager found didn't work. And so there was a review done of this Charles Lyell's book and Charles Lyell's contributions, which was done, in the last 10 years or something like that, published in various scientific magazines, scientific papers. And one of the guys wrote, and he said, Charles Lyell, it seems like he sold us snake oil, saying that processes were always had to be slow and gradual. And so it's interesting that there was this reaction, has been this reaction against uniformitarian, slow and gradual processes. But you see, it was Lyell and this slow and gradual processes which established the timeline. Now, without his insistence on everything being slow and gradual, you would not be able to determine a timeline. But now the timeline is established, geologists are a bit more relaxed about invoking catastrophic processes. But I think there's the debate's not over yet. There some sedimentologists and stratigraphers who are not happy with the new catastrophism. So I don't think that debate will go away. But certainly those things are consistent with Noah's flood. And I don't say this proves Noah's flood. I know the flood is true. I know the Bible is true. I assume that it's true. It's my starting point. It's my starting assumption. Everybody has a starting assumption. So with that starting assumption, I say, this evidence is consistent with that. I'm not surprised at this evidence because that's what I would expect with that starting assumption. So that's the way I approach it, is that I go and look at the evidence and find, yeah, it does fit with Noah's flood. So that's really cool.
And actually, while we are on the subject of flood geology, we should also bring up several criticisms of the creationist geological models, such as catastrophic plate tectonics, which was advocated in the Evolution's Achilles Heels documentary and book. Dr. William Moraker, who has a Bachelor of Science with honors in physics and a PhD in mathematics from the University of Bristol, is currently working on finding a scientific resolution as to how the heat released during the Genesis flood was removed without raising environmental temperatures beyond biological endurance limits. In a paper called Heat Problems Associated with Genesis Flood Models, Dr. Moraker wrote, "The Genesis flood must have produced drastic geological changes involving extremely energetic processes, which must also have generated an enormous heat load. Yet since the inhabitants of the ark and many aquatic creatures survived the flood, the heat must have been removed without raising temperatures beyond biological endurance limits." Dr. Walker, what are scientifically plausible resolutions to the heat problems of the Genesis flood models, like catastrophic plate tectonics?
Yeah, well, that raises an interesting point about our understanding of what happened in the past. As scientists, the study of geology is a problem because we can't go back in time to see what happened. We have the evidence in the present. We have the fossils, we have the rocks, and there's lots of evidence that's in the present that we can examine. And then we come up with our ideas about what happened. So this is a little bit of a diversion, but not really. So Charles Lyell, and before him James Hutton, who established this philosophy of so-called uniformitarianism, everything being the same. James Hutton said, the past history of our planet must be explained by what can be seen to be happening now. He died in the late 1700s, and so he comes up with this rule for how to study geology. It's his philosophy, and so we use current processes to explain what happened in the past. And when he came up with this rule, and he wrote a book called The Theory of the Earth, and he knew a little bit about the geology of the UK, a little bit about the geology of Europe, not much. He knew nothing about the geology of Australia, nothing about the geology of the United States, and yet he makes up this rule before he's studied the evidence, before he's looked at the evidence. This is how we're going to explain it. So he's already decided how it's going to be done. He knew nothing about, for example, turbidites, and he knew nothing about lots of processes, nothing about plate tectonics, and nothing about the geology of China. So the point I'm making is you come up with a philosophy, a framework of thinking before you go to the evidence. And that's exactly what we do with flood geology. We come up with an assumption. We say we believe the Bible is recording true history, events that really happened. So that's where our assumptions is. That's where our starting point is. So anytime we encounter a problem, we don't say, oops, throw the Bible out. We say, how are we going to explain that? And that's what William Warwicker is doing in those papers about the heat issue. So we have, how did it happen? And there's an idea has come up called catastrophic plate tectonics. It's a model which is developed by John Baumgartner, and it's a very popular model. It's similar in its unfolding to the plate tectonic model of mainstream geology. And so he has shown that these processes can happen very quickly, that the rocks of the mantle that they're composed of, they've got certain structure and stress characteristics that the plate tectonic can happen rapidly under certain conditions. High stress, high temperature, the movement of the plates can happen rapidly. So it's very, very interesting work. But that raises a question then. If the movement of the plates happens rapidly, and which involves releasing lots of energy, and the oceanic crust is uncovered rapidly, which is molten, partially melted mantle rock. If that's what's happened, then how's all that heat going to be handled? And so that raises a question. So what William Warwick is doing is he's quantifying the issue, how much heat is involved, where does the heat come from, what are some possible heat sinks that can take account of the heat, and he's written 2 papers on that, about that, and he is dealing with it, which is an appropriate way to deal with it. Even if we didn't have a solution, it doesn't mean we toss out flood geology. It just simply means we have a project to work on. The same way those who work on the uniformitarian geology, the problems that they have not caused them to reject uniformitarianism generally. So some of the ways that the heat has possibly been released. One is to do with how it can be contained within the magma by surface effects. Another one is the way it can be released to the atmosphere, perhaps from the ocean. And there's also some of the characteristics of the metamorphic processes which occur, how these can be absorbing heat. And these are some of the processes which people have looked at as a way of being able to come up with a clear answer to how catastrophic plate tectonics can have happened, and there can be no problem. The heat can all be accounted for. And of course, one of the interesting things is, and some of our creation geologists have said this, is that ultimately, we know that the flood was an event. It was a supernatural event where God said, he said to Noah to build the ark because he was going to destroy the earth. So that doesn't discount the fact that it's possible that there was some supernatural process involved which we don't know about today. As geologists and scientists, we're reluctant to appeal to something like that anytime we can't get an answer to our favorite model. And we say, well, maybe we'll try a different model. But ultimately, we can't discount that there could be some supernatural processes involved, just the same way as there were amazing supernatural events that occurred at the time of Jesus Christ, like when he turned the water into wine. Didn't take a long time. When he raised Lazarus from the dead, that was an amazing event. When he calmed the storm, when he turned the 2 loaves of bread and fishes and fed 5,000 people with them. So, but we don't like, as scientists, to invoke those just to save our favorite model.
Now that we've looked at solutions to various theoretical problems with creation geology models, let us look to the future of the field. Dr. Walker, in an article called Creationists, Hypocritical? Answering the Evolution is Science, Creation is Faith caricature, you wrote, creationists do careful scientific research and come up with answers to scientific problems. Dr. Walker, in light of your statement, what have been some recent developments in creation geology, and where do you expect the field to be in the next decade?
Well, basically, most of the things that occupy our attention are issues which have been raised as problems. And there's been lots of books which have been written by skeptics and by people who, well, you could call them anti-creationists, who do not want, who bring up all these arguments against the plausibility that flood geology could possibly be true. So they'll bring up these issues, and so those often make the focus of research work for creation scientists, for creation geologists. There are lots and lots of issues for creation geology, and there are lots and lots of issues which have been resolved. Now, some of the recent ones which have occurred, like it's amazing just how many there are. One of them is that, well, opals take millions of years to form. Even when you go to the jeweler will say, you can buy this for your loved one. It's millions of years in the making. And so people just accept that, well, flood geology can't be right because opals take millions of years to form. But then, you know, people have done research work. There's one guy called Len Cram who lives on a opal field in Australia called Lightning Ridge, and he has been able to replicate how opals can form. He uses, can you believe it, Vegemite jars in a little tin shed, and he puts the sediment in and a certain liquid, and within 10 days the opal colouring appears in the silica sand, in the silica sediment. And so it's a chemical process of the transformation of the hydration of the silica to form it into the opal structure. So that's just one example of how a challenge, how an obstacle has been answered. Often the answers come not necessarily from creationist research, but they come from just general research that's published in the general scientific literature, which creationists will discover. Although I know that there are creationist researchers who are doing amazing work. For example, soft tissue in dinosaur bones and dinosaur fossils is one which creationists have been working on. But one of the ones is in the formation of granite. Granite is a volcanic rock. It's formed underground. It's got nice crystals in it, which are easy to see with your eye. And so, and granite has been used as saying that how can the Bible be true? Because granite takes millions of years to form. And they have this idea of granite coming up through the crust of the earth like a great big balloon, a great big tower, a monstrous tower that's pushing its way up. And you see this is still published in geology textbooks. It's published in high school textbooks. But just 10 years ago, there's a big research papers which were published by the London Geological Society with the latest thinking on granite. And the idea is that granites form catastrophically in their suddenness. They don't take millions of years. The idea is that movements in the Earth's crust melts the rock, partially melts the rock, and which then goes up through these cracks or fissures in the rock, maybe 10 kilometers up through these fissures, and then it pools under the Earth in these great big magma chambers, these plutons, and all this happens within days, within weeks, and then it can cool and crystallize within a short period of time, the granites. And so there's articles on creation.com about the rapid formation of granites. So this is an example of where secular scientists who don't believe in Noah's flood and who have accepted the long ages of of the formation of granites, and discovered in their research that it doesn't work, and have come up with a new proposal. There's another one. Another one is to do with the formation of mudstone. The idea is, and this is what I was taught when I went back as a mature age student to the university, is mudstone is made of very fine particles of material, like fine particles of rock. So it's like mud. And if you throw mud into a bath or a pool, it will cloud the whole pool, and it will take a long time for the very fine particles to settle out. And you can actually calculate it out. And we used to do it. They had Stokes' equation for how long it takes a little particle to form, to go down through a fluid. And so you calculate how long it takes. And so the idea is, whenever people encountered mudstone, geologists encountered mudstone, they would interpret that. They would say, this must have been a lake which was very still, because it allowed, all those thousands of years for the mud to settle out, and there's a lot of mud. And so that was the idea, that the mudstones were automatically interpreted like that. Well, it was only in the last maybe 8 years or so that some geologists and some scientists have done experiments on how mud settles from flowing water. And they've discovered that it has a way, it sort of coagulates together, forms little sort of larger particles, and these settle out very rapidly from flowing water, and basically they said that all our interpretations of mudstones are going to have to be revisited because of our experiments in these racetrack flumes, they call them. So that's another example of how ideas which are assumed, this slow and gradual philosophy, led to assumptions about the past and about how things formed. And then with time, as people have examined these, they've found these assumptions were not correct. Another one is, for example, the formation of coal. It's generally considered that it takes millions of years for coal to form, millions of years of pressure and heat, and that it forms. But you know what? They do actually laboratory experiments and show that if you put coal in a sort of a sealed, strong steel container with some water, if you put some wood in there with some water and a catalyst like some volcanic ash or something like that, or some clay, and you heat it to a moderate temperature, like 150 degrees centigrade, which it might be, what would it be, 200 degrees Fahrenheit, not sure, but it's not a very hot temperature. It's a warm oven, but not really hot. And within a couple of weeks, the wood transforms into brown coal, the same sort of structure as brown coal. And so it doesn't take millions of years for coal to form. And so creationist geologists, and creationist scientists, they tackle the questions and the issues which are brought up. And there's been lots and lots of them that have been tackled. There's a book which Michael Ord has written called Dinosaur Challenges and Mysteries. Challenges and Mysteries. And it's connected with finding dinosaur footprints. They find them in the Rocky Mountains. They find dinosaur footprints in Australia. But you find multiple layers of strata with footprints on them. And then you find there's eggs of dinosaurs, dinosaur eggs. And they talk about dinosaur nests. And they'll say, well, how can you have dinosaurs making nests during a flood? Well, that was one of the puzzles which showed that these dinosaurs were actually under stress and in panic. And it was connected with needing to lay the eggs as the floodwaters were rising. And it was a temporary just being able to get out onto land, lay some eggs, and then be carried off again by more water. So that's really where the creation scientist is going. It's really solving the problem, solving the questions which come up, which are getting less and less because a lot of questions have been solved. But I think a bigger question for me is, and I think it's not really a scientific question, is to how the geological institutions are just so vehemently against even thinking about that the global flood could have been a real event. And the geological institutions, there'll be geologists who write articles about it, write books about it, and geological associations will publish papers against it. And I don't know how it's going to ever be possible to see a change in thinking, a change in being open to new ideas within these geological institutions. And they are such you could call them they're so tightly gripped as strongholds in our society. And we pray for our geological institutions and that there'll be a change, but it's going to be a real tough one to see happen.
No, actually, Dr. Walker, you just touched on your hope for the future of creationist research, and you mentioned geological societies, and there are evolutionary or geological societies that are committed to censoring creationists. In two articles called The Geological Society of London again moves to silence debate on creation science, and The Geological Society of London uses bully tactics, creationists not even worthy of the expediture of our contempt, you and Dr. Sarfati chronicled how the Geological Society of London claimed YECs, or Young Earth Creationists, desire is to foster in the minds of gullible people the illusion that they and their misguided notions are taken seriously by anyone who should be taken seriously. Contrary to that view, in another article called Creationists Attacked in Ireland, you wrote, "Creationists are not afraid of evidence. We agree with everything, absolutely everything, that is actually observed." Dr. Walker, for creationists who are seeking to publish their research, what is the most appropriate and moral manner in which to avoid censorship, if that is at all possible?
Well, it is possible, and there's quite a deal of research which creationists have published in the mainstream literature. And the way it has to be done is the person has to sort of fly under the radar. They can't be known as a creationist. They can't be. They have to sort of hide their light under a bushel in a way, and then they can publish their work. They can't refer to Noah's flood. They can't refer to anything that's got any biblical or creationist hints in it. And so what happens is, for example, they can publish a finding that they've made, which points to, say, catastrophe on a large scale, and just put that forward, and that could be published. That may be published if they don't try to draw any implications that this points to catastrophe or this points to global flood. If they don't make any of those sorts of comments in their article, then it's likely that it'll be published. And I know that there's been stuff published in the geological journals of the United States on that. There was an amazing find in South America of whales which were buried, I think 300 whales which were buried in like an algal bloom. And so these creationist researchers, I think it was from, is it Loma Linda University? They published in this geological journal. They documented what was there. They described it. They measured it, and all the details were there, and they just simply published it without drawing any implications. So the creationists can publish things like that. But as soon as they try to draw any implication from it, it'll be cut out. And if it becomes known that they are creationists, you know, if it becomes known, or people could say, well, we don't want to publish him because he's a creationist. Everybody knows he's a creationist geologist, so he's sort of, you know, banned. He's no longer kosher. So that happens. So how do creationists get it published? There are many creationist publications these days. There's Answers Research Journal. There's a Creation Research Quarterly. There's Origins magazine. It's published by Loma Linda, I think. There's Journal of Creation. That's one that Creation Ministries publishes. It's a technical journal. These are all academic journals. In addition, Creation Ministries has a magazine called Creation Magazine, which is a family magazine, but it's still, you know, high quality research published in there. And there are other sort of publications that people can get their work done in, published in. But it is necessary to keep a low profile. I corresponded with a person in the States who was studying, very interested in studying the geomorphology, that is the shape of the land, particularly up in the Appalachian Mountains. And they would use Google Earth, Google Maps, and they would look at the way the rivers cut across the mountains. Instead of going around them, the rivers just cut through them. And these are called water gaps. And so we were corresponding on this. And I have got a website called biblicalgeology.net. And this person would send me information. They'd make comments. And I would not publish their name, but I would publish their letter, their initials. I'd say, oh, so-and-so, BG, from, sent me this information, and I'd put it up on my website. Well, this person wrote a paper for the Geological Journal in the United States. And when they submitted, they wrote about these water gaps. It's a very good paper that they wrote. And the person who was the editor of this paper from the Geological Journal said, are you such and such BG from this particular site? If you are, you're not going to be able to get your stuff published. So that's the sort of threat that's there. I mean, even just an initial like that. And so this person contacted me and said, could you please take me or any reference to me off your site, which I did. But that just illustrates how terribly, what you might say, strangleholded the geological fraternity has on any idea. And it's the Geological Society of London, those articles that you mentioned, basically, they don't give any argument. They don't say this is wrong because. They just say, no geologist agrees with that. These people are trying to mislead everybody. They're picking out the gullible and trying to, ensnare the gullible in a terrible way. And so they're just throwing out scare tactics. And it's a consensus. Everybody agrees that what they're saying is nonsense. And so they shouldn't even be given a voice. They shouldn't even be given allowed to make a statement at a public, it was a Giant's Causeway that they were talking about. They shouldn't even be allowed to be mentioned. It was interesting, I just mentioned the Giant's Causeway, how that all came up, is that in Northern Ireland, there's quite a strong Christian presence there in Northern Ireland, more so than in most Western countries. And we were invited, I was invited to visit that place. I was invited to the Giant's Causeway to give a lecture because this Christian organization wanted to raise the awareness that there's another view, not just the evolutionary view. And they would talk to they say, how is it that in Northern Ireland, all you ever hear about is the evolutionary view when there's so many people go to church in Northern Ireland? And so that's why they invited Creation Ministries along to make presentations. And They were working the display centre, the visitors information centre at Giant's Causeway burned down, I think about 2001 or something like that. It burned down and it had to be replaced. And so the people in Northern Ireland said, we want to have a creationist interpretation of the Giant's Causeway. Why should it only be an evolutionary millions of years interpretation when there are good scientists who believe the Bible who interpret it in a different way? And so they lobbied the government, they lobbied people for 10 years, to try to get a creationist interpretation on the Giant's Causeway. And anyway, what they achieved was they got a 20-second segment on an audio file. That's all, 20 seconds segment on an audio file. So no one would see it unless they picked up this audio file, put on the headset, and they would leave a little 20-second segment, which basically said, not everybody agrees with this interpretation. And that was what the outrage was. That was what the outrage was from Dawkins and Cox and the various secular, scientific, so-called scientific geological societies. They were hostile. 20 seconds. And I think that just illustrates how biased and how much strong the opposition is to any thought that the Bible might say anything about the real world, about scientifically. And so there's a big issue. It's a spiritual issue. It's not a scientific issue. It's a spiritual issue. And we know what that's like.
Anyway, actually, Dr. Walker, in light of the fact that evolutionary journals and research societies seek to censor and ridicule creationists, one would think that their own publications are pristine and accurate. One would be wrong. In two articles called "They're Teaching Lies to Our Kids" and "They're Teaching Racism to Our Kids," you chronicled how textbooks are teaching lies such as Ernest Haeckel's fraudulent embryo drawings, and how textbooks used in government schools portray blacks as less evolved. Dr. Walker, for parents who do not want their child or children to be taught lies or racism, how would you recommend they help their children navigate secular schooling, if that is the schooling option they decide to go with?
Well, the key is for the children to be informed, and it has to start from a very young age. You're talking about 3 or 4 years of age, you know. So as soon as you start, children become old enough to, you know, listen to stories and that. So we start telling them all sorts of things, but we start giving them information about dinosaurs and the connection with the flood, and so this starts very young. And there's books these days for children, lots of good kids books. There's some for primary age, but there's some for even smaller age than that, you know, 4 and 5 years of age. I know that my grandkids love the books. I've got a grandson who's 9, and we have a book called Exploring Geology with Mr. Hibb. And I gave him a copy of it. I don't know if he knows where it came from, but I gave him a copy. And he was showing me, he said, "Have a look at this, Granddad." And he's showing me it has little cartoons and things and activities that they can do. He was so excited about this book. So he's somebody that likes real practical things. So you have to start with the kids young and all the way through. That's why we are passionate about people getting Creation magazine into their home, having it lying around so that the children can, you know, they might pick it up and there's a kids section in it. But we've had people write to us, and one guy said he was in his final year of high school. He said, "I've been reading creation stuff for years," and he says it's a lot of fun. So his family obviously got this stuff into their home, and he was reading it. You know, you don't have to force them. Some kids just love this stuff, and so I've been reading it for years. It's a lot of fun, and he says I actually find that I'm acing my final, you know, final high school year science class because of what I've learned in Creation magazine. are specifically about evolution. And he says, I seem to know more about it than my teachers. And so that's the key, is parents have to be informed, and they have to make sure their children are informed. And the sad thing is, in our culture, a lot of parents don't see it as an issue. What's the big deal? But it is a huge issue. There's something like 2 out of every 3 young people, when they go to college, they drop out of church. They grow up in church and they drop out of church because the people in college are experts at destroying the faith, of destroying and undermining the kids' confidence in the Bible. And they don't necessarily always do it overtly and in a nasty way. They're often so nice, but they just destroy the young people's confidence in the Bible. And if they've got no previous information about scientific evidence that the Bible is true, then they just become casualties to this. So that's one thing. How to, they need the information they need from a young age. Parents need to be aware of what they're learning and and listen when they come home from school, so that what they're picking up, and if something raises alarm bells, say, well, hang on, let's just go and find out about this that they're learning at school. And it affects everything. It affects sort of indigenous history. It affects Egyptian history. It affects so many things. I've got this evolutionary secular perspective that everything's taught from. So that's one thing. There's another thing. If people, there's a little bit to do with strategy for young people. Like when they encounter this at school, often they are a bit intimidated, thinking, oh, what am I going to do? And they don't know whether to speak up or not to speak up, and don't know how to answer write their assignments. They don't know how to do this. And so we have a couple of articles. I've written a couple of articles on this. I said one is how to survive evolution in high school. I've written that. And another one I've written is for university, is to how do I write my assignment about evolution? And a lot of young people think they feel like they've betrayed the side if they don't argue for creation, if they don't stand up and defend creation. They sometimes feel like they've let the side down. And I just think it show how you don't have to be overtly sort of gung-ho about trying to prove creation's right. All you have to do is to be aware yourself and to ask questions. You don't have to take on yourself the burden of proof, that you have to prove that creation is true. They're the ones that are telling you. So you have to learn the skill of being able to, what questions, there's a few simple questions to ask, learning to ask those questions, and then see how that responds. So that's one of the advices that we give. It's interesting. I was talking to somebody just recently, and they gave their son that advice. He came home and said, they're teaching all this stuff about evolution at school. And so his father sort of said, look, don't get out and try to sort of, prove it's wrong to the teacher and all this. Just take a quiet position, as I said. But it turns out the son said, I couldn't keep quiet. They're teaching these falsehoods, these things, lies. He said, I had to speak up. And so he spoke up, and there was this exchange with the teacher that went on for about 2 weeks. And eventually the teacher said, look, he said, I've just got to teach this. We're just going to have to stop. And so obviously the teacher, probably hadn't heard all that information before. But so it's a personality thing, how you respond. But if you don't feel guilty, if you don't stand up overtly, you can do a lot of damage by learning some good skills.
Now, actually, Dr. Walker, we've come to our final question. In a CMI article called Irreducible Complexity and cul-de-sacs. You responded to a skeptic by saying, "You'll never find your way out of a hole by continually digging it deeper." If you really want to know, if you're serious about resolving the question of whether God exists, who He is, and His plan for your life, you have to do a scientific experiment. You need to begin to talk to Him regularly. You can say, for example, "God, I don't know if you exist, or if you don't. As a matter of fact, I don't think you do. But if you do, I'm interested in knowing the truth and knowing you. If you do exist, I assume you would know about me and can hear me. Would you please reveal yourself to me?" Dr. Walker, while I hope that that skeptic gave his heart to God, what would you say to an individual who wants to deepen their walk with God?
Well, I think that's it. This is a spiritual issue. You know, we're not just talking about the mass of the sun or the size of an electron or things like that. We're talking about, you know, where did we come from, and who owns us, and ultimately what is my purpose in life, and I want to do my own thing. We're talking about those sorts of things, and it is a journey to find your way through. For any young person, everybody has to find their own way. And so in the early days, I used to think that if I got enough creation information and enough creation facts, and I could put the evidence out there and I could prove to anybody that it was true, and that they would have to then say, okay, yes, and they would give in and they would believe, you know. But it's not like that. You know, is that if the person's dug in, you know, if they're sort of made up their mind, they do not want anything to do with God, they want to do their own thing, and nothing that you say is going to change my mind, then you can still have a conversation, but, you know, you're not going to bring evidence against them. And I often think, well, if they're showing resistance, if everything that I say, they turn around straight away and come back with a no, that can't be right because, and you say something else, and they won't even consider what you say. It's not a conversation, but just rebuttal, resistance. You realize, no, there's something else going on in this person's life. And so I'll often change the conversation to talk about their life and things and their experiences. And so to try to find out what it might be that's why they've decided to take this position. So, but then there are other people, you know, who are genuinely seeking, for whom this creation issue is a stumbling block, and they do want to know. So that I'll take time with people and go through some of the obstacles that they have. But ultimately, what I've put there about that prayer is that that's a promise that the Creator God has given to us. He says that if you seek me, you will find me if you seek me with all your heart. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. And there's another one in Hebrews which says, anyone who comes to God must believe that he exists. So that prayer that you read out, it's the guy said, I don't know if you exist. Well, that's his intellectual position. But the fact that he said that into the sky to a God who may be there that he doesn't know is not, that's a step of faith. And he said, I don't know if you exist, but if you do, so anybody that comes to God must believe, must take that step of faith, and God will respond. The reason, and so I do challenge people like that, and say, look, you know, just seek, just ask. God will reveal himself to you, and that's a wonderful thing. A lot of people that I'm sort of colleagues with in Creation Ministries, a lot, or number, maybe not a lot, that who were atheists. They were atheists, and who they pray that sort of a prayer. Carl Willand was one, as I understand. Another friend of mine, David Catchpole, was another. Quite a number of people who said, well, I don't know if you're there or not, but if you are, I do want to know the truth. And I can think of a lot of people that have had that experience of saying, okay, I'll give you a month. I'll give you a month. I'm going to pretend that you're there for a month and give you that opportunity to reveal yourself to me. And and isn't God good the way he does that? And so that's, I don't know if that's answered your question or not, but I think it takes it out of the science stuff, which science is really good. And I think having this information is very, very helpful. It gives us lots of confidence. It answers obstacles, clears away sticking points and that. So it's very, very helpful. Takes away the uncertainty in so many areas and gives us clarity. So it's very, very important from that area. But that's not all. It's about a relationship with our Creator God. And so we need to enter into that relationship, learn to just to be open with him and learn to hear him the way he speaks to us in different ways. And then that's when we know that he's real. And the creation, all the creation science stuff is very, very helpful to give us confidence.
Amen. And Dr. Walker, thank you very much for your time. It was an absolute joy. And to our listeners, thank you for taking the time to learn with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. You can find Dr. Walker's website, biblicalgeology.net, and his articles on CMI's website, along with a link to Evolution's Achilles' Heels, which you can get at a sales price, in the description of this video. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It's available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.